On the day George got engaged to my sister, I sat in the front row of the audience. He saw me and inexplicably breathed a sigh of relief. "Christina, have you finally had enough trouble?" Apologized to me. All the guests were scared out of their wits, not knowing who he was talking to. Because I was already dead. Today is exactly the 7th day since I died. The day before I died, George broke up with me because he was getting engaged to my sister. I plucked up the courage to ask him, "George, can you not marry her?" George's eyebrows nodded in displeasure, and he tightened his grip on my waist. "Christina, if you need money, just say it. Acting coy is very off-putting. Don't forget what you're here for. Do you love money that much? Do you love stealing other people's things? Aren't you cheap?" My face fell. I hadn't forgotten. I was here because my sister Victoria had heart disease and couldn't do strenuous exercise. But my parents didn't want to miss the opportunity to connect with George. So they let me serve George in my sister's place. Serve. A word of absolute inequality. But when the disparity in wealth and power is drastic, and even your own parents don't treat you like a human being, all notions of human rights and women's rights become irrelevant. Your sister will be well enough to get out of the hospital soon, and she can get engaged and married. You fakes need to get out of here, and don't delude yourself into thinking you can usurp your sister's husband. The voice of my mother cursing echoed in my ears. My heart ached, and I laughed lightly, clinging tighter on George's neck. "I am a bit short of money. How about another 500,000? The dim light hid the tears in my eyes. No one believed that I, a substitute, was genuinely in love with George. "Seeing you getting engaged, I want to do something I want to do. Let's consider this money as my dowry gift for being with you all these years." On the day I died, George was in a really bad mood. After hearing me say I wanted to get married, he immediately became cold, got up, and left me feeling empty. Then, he gave me 2 options: take back what I just said or get lost. He often left me with choices before, usually apologizing or getting out. I generally chose the first. After all, when he said get out, he really meant standing at the door all night. But this time, I decisively chose the latter. Before hopping off the bed lightly to pack up my luggage, I kissed George's lips reluctantly and smiled brilliantly. "George, thank you for taking care of me these 3 years. Goodbye." Apart from what George had given me, I really didn't have many personal possessions. After all, a homeless person dare not have too many belongings. By the time I finished packing, it was nearly dawn. I pulled my suitcase and quietly exited the room. George was already dressed in his pajamas, waiting for me in the living room. He casually threw a $50,000 check at me, his face gloomier than ever. His eyes trembled, his lips moved, and incredibly, he spoke again. "Christina, apologize to me now, and you can take it back. You wanted money, didn't you? I'm giving it to you." The effect of this statement was as astonishing as a meteorite hitting the earth, and I almost dropped my suitcase in shock. George was always the one who had people begging for mercy, offering him every possible face-saving. When did he ever actively give someone a way out? "George, I wish you and my sister a happy marriage." With a sincere blessing, I turned around and laughed. Then, tears filled my eyes. My fingers turned white as they gripped the suitcase handle. I cried, then laughed. But it's okay, I've lost my love, but I have 50,000. That should cover my grandmother's surgery. I'm dead. I looked up at the ferryman of souls and tugged at the corner of my mouth. "Have you seen my grandmother? She should be just ahead of me, half an hour. Why don't you learn from her?" As 2 lines of bloody tears ran down my cheeks, my laugh was melancholy and heartbreaking. "Her soup is the best in the world. She was the only one in the world who cared about me. It was my fault I couldn't save her. But why, oh why couldn't I just take that one final step to save her?" The soul ferryman, with his pair of deep black eyes, stared at me silently. He then softly touched my head. Although his touch was cold, I felt warmth spread within me. He seemed to say, "You tried your best." A flash of white light appeared before my eyes, and when I opened them again, I was back to the human world. More precisely, a soul bound within a 5-meter distance of a man named George. On the first day after my death, I floated in the air, idly watching George working in his office. George looked just as handsome as ever. His suit jacket was draped over the back of his chair, his white shirt sleeve rolled up to reveal his strong arm. Even the cufflinks he wore were chosen by me. No matter what I do, I can only be a substitute for my sister. After all, our destinies are so different. For George, my sister is his childhood sweetheart, the one he nurtured and cherished. How could he allow her to deal with such mundane matters? As for me, the not-so-loved daughter, well, he had no issues relegating these chores to me. Now, it seemed like George was waiting for some news which he never received. He kept checking his phone and angrily throwing it down. And his face turned so black when it was time to clock off from work that it looked like it could drip with ink. It was peculiarly strange. However, not having me to remind him to eat on time, pay heed to the weather, and share the trivialities of life, his message box wasn't very lively. I never realized I was such a chatterbox before I died. Perhaps that's why he found me so annoying. On the second day after my death, George's expression only got worse. Arriving home, he threw away all the little trinkets that I used to own. He gave my sister diamond jewelry while all that I received were gifts with purchase. I cherished and kept everything he gave me, but he didn't seem to have any qualms about throwing them away. His housekeeper nervously suggested, perhaps we should bring back Christina? Standing beside them, I couldn't help but shake my head. I'm dead, where on earth are you going to bring me back from? George's face was ice cold as he turned and went upstairs. No need. But what was strange was that night, he slept in my room, holding onto my pillow as he slept. On the third day after my death, a Saturday, George had the day off. He didn't go to work. Instead, he burned all my pictures at home. Our families have always been close, but I haven't lived with my parents since I was 10. Of course, my contact with George couldn't compare with that of my sisters. I was her substitute for 3 years, and yet there wasn't even a proper picture with him. All these photos were taken secretly by me. But as for him, he burned everything. He may as well have pulled my remains up and burned them too. It's so cold at the bottom of the river. On the 4th day after my death, a Sunday, George took an axe and cut down the tree that I had personally nurtured for 3 years. One by one, he uprooted the precious roses I had been watering and feeding. What a despicable man! He clearly knew that those flowers were a labor of my love. My sister loved fresh flowers, just picked, at their brightest. So my mother forced me to study horticulture. After crossing paths with George, he was generous enough to allocate a section of his garden to me to plant flowers for my sister. Every day, I'd pick the freshest ones and deliver them to my sister's hospital room. Now that my sister's illness is almost cured, he has the heart to uproot all the flowers. Anyway, without me to look after them, the plants would have died in the end. Just like how, if my grandmother hadn't adopted me and raised me by picking up scraps, I, the daughter of a wealthy man, would have starved to death on the streets, lifeless and unclaimed. Without my grandmother, I am indeed dead now. And these flowers will follow suit. On the 5th day after my death, George still slept in my room. It was as if he had moved in. My parents and sister arrived to discuss the engagement process with him, although it seemed they were mostly discussing among themselves. George was quietly listening before suddenly interjecting, "Why hasn't Christina come?" My parents and sister were taken aback. My mother then laughed awkwardly and lightly responded, "She never lets us know her whereabouts, and we can't control it." Standing to the side, I pouted. It wasn't that they couldn't control it, it was that they simply didn't care. When my mother gave birth to my sister and me, it was a difficult delivery. She almost died on the operating table. And when we were born, my twin sister had a heart condition while I was extraordinarily healthy. They say that with twins, one often comes as a creditor and the other as a debtor. Clearly, I was the one seen as the creditor. My grandparents were already unhappy with my mother and used this as an excuse to make things more difficult for her, blaming her for making a loss in childbirth. My mother then put all the blame on me. She believes that I stole my sister's nutrients in the womb, causing my sister to suffer as soon as she was born and causing her further distress from my grandparents. Therefore, everything should make way for my sister. When my sister was in the hospital, I couldn't even return home. They have no idea where I lived, and they certainly do not know where I am now. After understanding the situation, George didn't say anything. There was a flash of jealousy in my sister's eyes, and then she leaned on George's shoulder and said, "George, Victoria must be mad at me, right? Blaming myself for my weak body and causing trouble to Victoria. If I wasn't around, she would have been happier, right? If Victoria also likes George as I do, I should just give him to her." Hearing this, my mother was more furious than before and quickly held onto my sister's hand and gave it a gentle pat. "Stop thinking needless thoughts, you're the one who's most blessed. Victoria is an uncultured wolf who even competed with you in the womb. What right does she have to vie for marriage?" she said, barely masking the heartache in her eyes as she cuddled my sister and comforted her. "She should not even be here. We don't need her bringing us bad luck." My sister nestled in our mother's arms, whispering weakly, "But we're sisters after all. At the time of my wedding, I do hope to have her blessings." As she said this, she glanced at George with inquisitive eyes. George, however, was looking down at his phone, lost in thought. I moved to their sides, and in a mischievous manner, blew a ghostly wind near Victoria's ear. "Victoria, you're lying. You witnessed my death, and yet you pretend not to know. How wicked you are." After that, I reached out a hand towards my mother, murmuring sadly, "Is a mother's hug warm? What does it feel like to be held by a mother? It must feel like how Grandma used to hold me, right?" Day 6 after death. Someone kept coming over to confirm the details of George's engagement ceremony for the next day. However, George was slightly absent-minded. Finally, he instructed his assistant, "Find Christina." He also sent me a message saying, "Christina, come back. I will give you as much money as you want." I couldn't help but laugh. How could he think that I was so fond of money? I was dead, and money was useless to me. But I don't want to let George find me. I don't want him to see my dead body. The body was miserable and ugly. Naturally, George didn't receive my reply. He got angry and threw his phone aside, gritting his teeth, "If you have the guts, never come back." I laughed and cried. "George, I am quite gutsy this time." Day 7 after death. The engagement ceremony. After all, it was the marriage event of two big families, and there were many guests. Many guests were stating how perfect the match of two childhood sweethearts walking into a marriage was. I sat in the front row, wanting to witness with my own eyes how the man I loved the most was marrying my beautiful and happy sister. My mother was sitting next to me, sending messages to my father with a grave expression. "Where have you been? If Christina doesn't want to come, so be it. You hurry back, now." What could be more important than Christina's wedding? It was only after a long while that my dad replied, "Victoria is dead. She committed suicide by jumping into the lake 7 days ago." My mother was taken aback, looking like in a stupor. My father continued to send messages, "They found the body last night. Practically the entire city knows." It's ironic, isn't it? The engagement ceremony for my elder daughter. My younger daughter committed suicide, and no one knows about it. The entire city knows I'm dead, but my own parents are busy with my sister's wedding and have no idea. No wonder the guests' expressions are so strange. My father sent another message, "It's the 7th day since her death today. This is such bad luck." Was he blaming me for dying at the wrong time? Is it my fault that Victoria had to postpone the engagement? Dad, it's not my fault. It was my sister who insisted on rushing me to my death on that day. Perhaps she got what she deserved. The ceremony began, and George led my sister slowly onto the stage. He looked really handsome today. Even though he was dressed in the same suit and leather shoes, he looked exceptional handsome. My sister looked gorgeous too. She had applied makeup, and her earlier fragile state was gone. She looked even more beautiful. We are indeed sisters. Our taste in wedding gowns is quite similar. It was my favorite one-shoulder diamond-studded dress, which made her neck look more elongated and shoulders more graceful. If only one of us sisters could be happy, then my sister will probably double up on happiness. Thinking about this, it didn't seem so hateful anymore, considering I was already dead. However, it was strange that even though my gorgeous sister was standing in front of him, George's gaze was wandering around the audience as if he was looking for someone. Finally, to my surprise, he met my gaze. He said as if relieved, "Christina, have you had enough fun?" Apologize to me, My sister's face changed suddenly. She almost blurted out, "George, what are you talking about? Victoria?" I raised my eyebrows and thought to myself, was she slipping up? However, my sister quickly composed herself. She forced a smile and closed her mouth. My mom sitting beside me was not so composed. She was scared witless by George and was looking at me with a pale face. "George, what are you saying? There is no one there?" My mom was very panicked. George was stunned, looking clearly at me, his gaze sweeping over all the guests. "She's right here. Can't you all see her?" The faces of both my sister and my mother changed. The guests were in an uproar. The faint-hearted had already started running out. My sister stepped forward, grabbed George's arm with one hand and held her chest with the other. Biting her lip, her tenderness and charm were irresistible even to me. "George, stop it. Victoria said she won't come." This commotion frightens me, my heart is racing, and I feel very uncomfortable. Could we please not make a scene over this trivial matter while we are amidst the ceremony? However, George ignored her, shook off her hand, and walked over to me with a gloomy expression, his brows frowning. "Christina, what kind of a show are you putting on now?" I was quite surprised. This was the first time that George ignored my sister's excuse of a heart condition. Previously, whenever she claimed that her heart was hurting, even at 3 in the morning, George would drop everything and be with her in the hospital. Once, when I had acute appendicitis at 3 in the morning, George abandoned me halfway because of a single sentence from my sister. He didn't care whether I lived or died. I looked at George and smiled faintly. What could I, a soul, perform? Seeing my silence, George was almost out of patience, not sure what he was rushing about. "Christina, speak." This testimony made even more guests flee. Even my mother had run quite a few steps out. My sister hadn't moved. Her face was extremely pale. She was clenching her fists and staring in my direction. However, from the focal points of my sister's gaze, I could affirm that she couldn't see me. Among the crowd fleeing, my assistant was the only one running towards us, making him stand out. Crossing through the crowd, he walked to George with a serious expression on his face, took a deep breath and said, "Boss, they found Victoria. She drowned herself in the lake 7 days ago. Her body is currently in the hospital." George was hit like a bolt of lightning, his dark eyes stared at me in disbelief. I tilted my head and gave him a sad smile. I didn't lie. I am really dead. George, seeing my presence, not only surpassed my imagination, but his own as well. Even though the news of my death and my body were right before him, he couldn't believe it. His hands were trembling as he reached out to touch my face. I didn't move and let his hand pass through my soul, touching nothing but thin air. I felt the sheer effect of his hand passing through my body was more effective than any body. The instant his hand passed through, the emotions in George's eyes began to collapse. It shattered into incredible tremors. He kept reaching out, trying to touch me, hold me, feel me, all in vain. To onlookers like my sister and my mother, he seemed like he was going crazy. George shook his head, refusing to give in. "Impossible, impossible. George, I'm dead." I calmly told him, feeling neither emotional ups and downs nor understanding. Wasn't it he who didn't love me? Wasn't it he who just saw me as a substitute for my sister? Over the years, he has been so harsh on me for the sake of my sister. Now doing this, I almost thought he truly loved me. But apart from my grandmother, who else could love Christina? The day you broke up with me was the day I died. I died at the bottom of the river, not far from the hospital. The water was so cold at night, really cold. As I said this, I paused and gave him a pleading smile. My grandmother's corpse was still in the hospital, and I didn't know how they handled it. "Seeing that I have served you for at least 3 years, can you help me bury us together? I'm afraid that in the next life, Grandma won't be able to find me." George's hands that hung on his side began to tremble violently. He glared at me, his eyes gradually turned red, and then he roared loudly and kicked the seat beside me violently. The rows of chairs didn't move, but they made a loud noise that startled everyone. "Stop your damn act, Christina! Get out and stop playing! There has to be a bottom line, Christina! Come out!" He still has such a bad temper, yelling at me for no reason. Can't he hear what I'm saying, even though he can see me? Doesn't he think I'm just some holographic projection? Please calm down. The assistant was the calm one. Before George's rampage became more intense, he stepped forward and grabbed George's arm. "Listen to me, Victoria's body is indeed in the morgue. It has been confirmed that she has been dead for 7 days." Upon hearing this, my mother and sister hurriedly moved forward to say something, but they were stopped by the assistant's eyes. Then he earnestly looked at George. "Or, let's go and claim the body first, and then decide what to do next." When he said these words, the assistant spoke very quickly, fearing that speaking slowly could trigger George. After speaking, he immediately let go of George and retreated a few steps. Seeing this, I couldn't help but sigh with appreciation. After all, he had a way with people. I don't know if it's because ghosts have slower reactions and perceptions, but now that I face George, I feel quite at ease. He's right. You can see me, which means you are someone involved in metaphysical activities. You might not be able to see me tomorrow. Why not kindly retrieve my body and fulfill my unaccomplished last wish? After all, you've been pretty harsh on me these past 3 years. Of course, you can refuse. Anyway, I can't do anything about you. George looked at me deeply, his chest heaved violently, and the green veins in his neck bulged. Just when I thought he was going to hit me, he only said one word, "Let's go." It's really strange to look at your own body. After being soaked in the river for 7 days, the corpse was really ugly. It was pale and swollen, and even the shoes that my grandma bought me were cracked. My mother seemed to finally remember that I was her biological daughter. Her eyes blankly stared at my body. The news of my death was only shocking at first, but now, seeing it with her own eyes, there was a sadness in her eyes that was unfamiliar to me. "How did she die?" a police officer asked. "Suicide," another one replied, coldly handing over a document, not looking happy. Seeing my sister in a wedding dress, my mother in a cheongsam, and my father in a suit, she couldn't help grinning. "How considerate of you to proceed with the wedding even after your sister has been missing for 7 days. If you ask me, you could have waited until after the wedding, or even after you have children, and then mourn. The effect would be the same." The words made my mother choke. She didn't know whether to cry or not. It was a little funny. My sister pulled my mother to her side and gave the policewoman an apologetic smile, speaking softly, "I'm sorry, my mother is just overwhelmed with sadness. She hasn't been quite herself." The policewoman scanned my sister's wedding dress with a look of mockery, but said nothing. The last one to come in, George, only took a glance at my body, then turned cold. Turning around to look at me, his voice was indifferent, yet stubborn. "She's not Christina. Christina is right in front of me." I didn't respond, I just tilted my head down and looked at his hand. If George hadn't trembled so violently when he said this, I might have believed he was telling the truth. But he couldn't accept the reality that it was indeed me. After speaking, George did a motion as if he wanted to grab my arm, but halfway through, he hesitated, looking afraid, and drew back. He insisted in a stiff voice, "Christina, come home with me." To the 2 police officers and my father, he looked like a madman. My sister had already recovered from the initial shock and softly explained to them, "He's just had a big blow and is hallucinating." The male police officer glanced at George's groom suit and exclaimed, "They must have been really close." The policewoman stayed silent, a cold look on her face. If I hadn't died, I'd have had a good chat with this policewoman about how I was used as a bed warmer and had no rights at all. George seemed deaf to any other noises and stubbornly repeated, "Christina, come home with me." I chuckled and said, "I have no home." Christina never had a home. A home is somewhere you never have to worry about being kicked out. How can a place where I was easily expelled be considered a home? Did you forget, George? Every time you came back from the hospital after seeing my sister, you'd be so angry, you'd kick me out, telling me to sleep on the bench outside. For 3 years, anytime my sister felt uncomfortable, I'd be thrown out. Regardless of the time, the weather, or what I was wearing. I also had to be at her beck and call, obedient without complaint. Once, in the middle of the night, my sister wanted to eat crab. I had to make it for her, peel it by hand, and give it to her. If I was 1 minute late, I had to wait outside the hospital room for an hour, and then watch George throw away the crab meat I'd so carefully peeled. How can such a place be considered home? George must have remembered it, so he seemed stunned, his expression complex. But in the end, he said in a cold and unyielding voice, "She's not Christina. I don't accept that this is her body." The policewoman took a few deep breaths, but eventually lost her patience. With a low voice and anger filling her face, she smashed the documents in her hand on the table, causing the paper to scatter everywhere, with many ending up on the floor. "The person is dead. Can't you let her rest in peace? She suffered so much in her lifetime, can't she rest in peace after death? How much do you hate her?" The word hate. It isn't really accurate. George cannot be said to hate me, he just loathes me, looks down upon me. Actually, George and I also played together before we were 10 years old. He was very nice to me at that time. He was a very gentle and caring big brother, often accompanied me to play after taking care of my sister. It's just that year, my sister's illness reached its peak. Seeing me made her cry, crying that her health was taken away by me. Crying that I caused her to suffer this unbearable pain. Crying why I was so happy and carefree, why I could play with her brother George. My mother was heartbroken from her crying, her eyes looking at me become loathsome. When we got home that night, she smashed my bowl, claiming that I was heartless. How could I still eat when my sister was so sick? Just as my mother was nearly going to hit me in anger, my dad casually said, "Anyway, there are many properties in the house. If Christina doesn't want to see her, doesn't want her to associate with George, let her move out. When Christina is no longer suffering, then we will bring her back." In this way, at the age of 10, I moved out of that home. Never saw George again. 3 years ago when we met again, I had become my sister's bed substitute, he became my sugar daddy. I still remember that gloomy rainy day. I was standing in George's living room, my excitement froze after hearing his first words to me when he saw me. "Christina, long time no see, you still love to snatch other people's things." In that moment, I seemed to see my parents. I clearly realized I was forever a sinner in George's eyes. A sinner who had to pay for my sister's sins all my life. My father suddenly frowned, bending over to pick up a piece of paper. That was my bank statement. Most of the transactions were money transferred to one person. After recalling for a while, my father seemed to remember something, that maid who was dismissed after stealing from our house. Why would Victoria give her money? The policewoman let out a very quick and light sneer. Then retracted her smile and said solemnly to my father, "Because she is the only one who was nice to Christina these years. Because she supported Christina for 8 years by collecting trash and doing odd jobs, preventing Christina from starving or freezing to death." After she said this, the whole room fell into a deathly silence. My sister covered her mouth in surprise as if she was hearing this for the first time. How could this be? How is it possible? The heiress of a wealthy family, actually almost starved on the streets. The policewoman shrugged again in a weird way. My sister couldn't save face after being dismantled twice by her. She glanced at George's gloomy and silent face, turned her head, and covered her heart with her hands emotionally as she looked at my parents with teary eyes. "Dad, Mom, has Victoria been living this life these years? Why didn't you guys tell me?" I was about to laugh. The way they spoke, they never cared about me. How could they possibly know that the housekeeper did not follow their instructions and give me living expenses regularly every month? Kids that their parents don't love, no one else will. The salary that the housekeeper had handed to me was barely enough to cover the tuition fee, let alone my living expenses. I was just about to faint from hunger when I bumped into the nanny who had taken care of me when I was a child. She had been expelled due to her naive nature and false accusations. Seeing my plight, she took me in and cared for me. She provided a warm home and a shoulder for me to cry on. However, I couldn't protect her at the end. 3 years ago, the old lady was diagnosed with stomach cancer and was hospitalized. The towering medical bills were always paid by Christina. It was on the morning that Christina had paid for the operation that the old lady tragically died on the operating table. Half an hour after her death, Christina also committed suicide by jumping into a lake. Finished telling her story, the policewoman raised her head, looking at my sister and parents. "Did you have an inkling about any of this?" Confronted by the policewoman's query, my mother shook her head vigorously. Her tone was assertive, and she refused to admit any mistakes. Why didn't she say anything if she was so penniless? She periodically joined us for family reunions through the years, but she never mentioned her financial struggles. My mother trailed off, her expression revealing a hint of regret. Apparently, she just remembered the many times I had attempted to inform them that I was struggling financially, urging them to investigate the disheartening state of affairs. Their response had been entirely unsupportive. My mother had defended her lavish lifestyle, accusing me of lying to get my hands on money. She had shouted about my thick skin, questioning my ability to live such an affluent lifestyle. The only time they realized that I was broke and bothered to provide financial assistance was when I agreed to take my sister's place. They did not want my poverty to irk George. A dead silence filled the room. George looked at my sister, his eyes cold and emotionless. Astonishingly, a chill went down my spine. His voice, filled with bone-shattering intensity, echoed through the room, making me shiver. His question: "Is this what you were implying? That Christina agreed to stay by my side just to steal you away from me? It was out of jealousy that you possessed me, an affluent and powerful fiancé, coveting my wealth and power?" At this point, Victoria suddenly felt a sharp pain in her chest, took several deep breaths, and leaned against my mother for support. I sighed and hung my head in resignation. It was obvious that Victoria's mother had been a good mother to her. But Christina's mother hadn't been. The policewoman slowly repeated the word greedy with a mocking, sarcastic laugh. Her eyes welled up with tears. Christina had gone to extreme lengths to arrange funds for her nanny's treatment. She sold her blood and was on the verge of being tricked by unscrupulous medical clinics into selling her kidney. With a cold, piercing stare, she looked at my lifeless body. The policewoman trembled as she spoke, tears falling from her eyes. She murmured, "What did Christina do wrong? Isn't it you who brought her into this world? Who is there for Christina when she was suffering?" Even once, I didn't get a chance to respond to this litany of questions. My mother's face turned white. Habitually blaming me for everything wrong in her life, she was struggling to find someone to point her finger at now. Her usually well-preserved complexion drained out of color. She took a few deep breaths, but still, stumbled back a few steps. Victoria suddenly clutched at her chest, complaining, "Mom, it hurts so much, I can't breathe." George, surprising everyone, didn't react. In contrast to his usual self, my dad quickly rushed over, and as effortlessly as picking up a child, he cradled my sister against his chest. And then they were gone. Meanwhile, the policewoman punched the air in anger. "It's this family that deserves to die. If I were Christina, I would become a ghost and drag them all to hell." I stayed back with the policeman and said, "Thank you, stranger. Christina is grateful to you." A sudden voice startled the policeman. I was standing at the back seat of George's car. I pleaded, "George, if you don't help me get my body back after today, I may disappear forever. Please help me retrieve my body." George snapped at me, "Shut up." The intensity of his tone was so fierce that I was taken aback. The assistant asked tentatively, "Boss?" George coldly ordered, "Check where the nanny was buried." I sat quietly in the passenger seat while George drove us home. His eyes unblinkingly fixed on the road and his angled face reflecting the cold evening light. George suddenly declared, "I will certainly retain you." I seemed a bit taken aback. "But I am dead, didn't you see my body?" George raised his voice, "You are right in front of me, why should I accept your death?" He declared boldly, "That's not you, I won't accept your body." I was startled by his sudden outburst. "You are so grumpy, how come you have such a bad temper? Why are you still shouting at me even after I am dead?" Squaring his jaw, George added, "I will change. He looked at me and pleaded, "From now on, I will change whatever you don't like, as long as you stay." His tone softened. "Christina, tell me, how can I bring you back? I am confused." "Why do you want to save me?" I asked. "I committed suicide. The meaning of suicide is that I have no nostalgia for this world. Without my grandmother, what's the point of my existence?" George didn't say anything. He just drove us back home, and then frantically started looking for ways and resources to contact the dead or keep my soul. Eden was silent for a while, not knowing what to say. I floated in midair, waiting curiously to see if there was any dark magic in this world that could really keep my soul. And George sure was George. Under the influence of money and power, at around 8 o'clock in the evening, someone did come up with a seemingly possible solution, needing something worth a fortune to carry out a seance. For George, this was a piece of cake because he was really rich. The news of high-priced treasure acquisition quickly spread, and George put down his phone, looking up at me. Though there was no explicit excitement, his eyes were bright. "Someone would soon bring that thing here, Christina. I can keep you, I must be able to keep you." I floated down from the air and stared at the madness in his eyes. "George, have you forgotten? You are my brother-in-law. You used to spoil my sister so much, bullying me for her sake. When she cried, I had to cry double. When she hurt, I had to hurt twice as much. Why are you going to such lengths to keep me now? Is it that even my life isn't enough to pay back my sister? Do you want to bring me back to keep confessing? Is she everyone's sweetheart, and I'm just a nobody?" George paused for a moment, his lips moved slightly, he looked down and did not look into my eyes again. After a while, he spoke, his voice was very soft. But I heard him clearly. "I don't want to lose you." It wasn't the answer I was expecting. But it was much better than what I was expecting. Thinking back to his actions over the past few days, he does seem to have fallen in love with me. "George, do you know why I like you?" I suddenly spoke out, changing the topic. George shivered violently, his face stunned. "The first piece of candy I ever had was given by you, and I still remember the taste to this day. It turns out there are things in the world that can be so sweet. I was really starved for love, really wanted someone to love me, no matter how small the warmth, I would do everything I could to get closer. So agreeing to accompany you wasn't just for the money, but also to indulge my obsession with love. This 3-year deal, which saved my grandmother while also allowing me to indulge in my love for George, was my way of accepting the fact that I had fallen in love with George. But even in love, there is a line. I never thought about ending up with George. I only thought about ending the deal, saving my grandmother, and then pulling away decisively. The fact that George could accept me as a substitute while he was in love with my sister was completely absurd. He not only insulted me, but also insulted the word love. What I couldn't accept even more was that my whole family defaultly accepted this way. They didn't even feel a bit of guilt. Therefore, on the day I broke up with him, I told him not to marry Victoria, rather than not to marry her and marry me. Because that was my last piece of advice for him, and nothing more. My sister had a poor heart, but was so cunning. She really wasn't a good wife material. Yet George used the words cheap to scorn me, responding to me with 3 years of disrespect and bullying. "So George, please don't say you love me, it's disgusting." George's expression suddenly stiffened. His thin lips were trembling as he was about to speak, but his phone rang. The urgency of the ringtone seemed to tear a hole in the dense sadness of the room, and I let out a sigh of relief. George wiped his face and answered the phone. It was his assistant. "Boss, someone has delivered that thing, and the money has been given to them. Also, the burial place of that old woman has been found. Should we bring Christina?" George's fingers tightened, his knuckles turned white from the strain. After his chest heaved a few times, he coldly refused, "No need." I raised my eyebrows, not surprised. The assistant also seemed unsurprised. He paused and added, "When looking for the body, I saw a familiar face in the hospital surveillance. The last person Victoria and her grandmother saw before they died was her." George's forehead tensed up. "Who?" "Your fiancée, Victoria. I don't know if the seance thing worked, but I didn't disappear after that day." George hadn't slept all night, staying up with me until dawn. The moment the sun came out, his tense chest suddenly loosened, he looked up at me and revealed a victor's smile. "Christina, I've kept you." I sat by the window, quietly looking out, without turning my head. But in my heart, I questioned, have you really managed to keep me? Can you really hold me, even if he wanted to act? Could anyone let him? Indeed, in the afternoon, my parents came with my sister. My sister's face had improved a lot, but she looked mournful and scared. My mother seemed to have not slept well. She looked bad. For a person who even puts makeup on to walk the dog, this was the first time she has been seen disheveled. My dad, a man who couldn't even handle his wife's bad relationship with her in-laws, couldn't hope for anything, could I? Both my grandparents were misogynistic, as was my dad. Really, he didn't care much about either of his daughters. It's just that everyone said I was a dead ghost, and they hated me more for it. The day Victoria got sick was the first time I saw my dad so upset about my death. Because, once I was dead, he would only have one daughter left. No more turning a blind eye. If anything else happened to Victoria, he would no longer have any children. The odds of making a new one at almost 50 are not high. "George, Victoria's body has been lying there for a long time. It's time for us to claim it for the cremation. The whole city is abuzz, waiting to see how we handle it. If we procrastinate further, it won't be good for both families." My father said this, frowning at George, who was clearly even colder towards him, showing dissatisfaction. After all, he is his future father-in-law. If he doesn't respect him normally, let alone now? "Christina will live, do not cremate her." George coldly raised his head and stared at the three people before him. The depth in his eyes made all three of them dazed. Victoria paused for a moment and mustered a delicate smile. She walked up and shook George's sleeve. "George, I was so sick yesterday, you didn't come to see me. Are you mad at me about Victoria? I am also very hurt by what happened to Victoria. I had no idea how Mom and Dad would, she knew. I started slowly. The day I died, she was on the bank, watching me tie a stone to my foot, watching me jump in. No, to be precise, she forced me to jump." I stared intently at Victoria, oblivious to the fact that my mom had suddenly turned towards me, her eyes filled with horror. "Didn't you know?" George laughed too, looking at Victoria as if he was seeing her for the first time, fixating on her face that was about 70 to 80% similar to mine. Then, he laughed mockingly. "Christina, you've been associated with hospitals since you were little, so your parents and I would often subconsciously think that you're an innocent, pure girl. But now it seems that when you lie, you really don't bat an eye. No wonder over the years, you've kept us spinning around in the palm of your hand with your heart disease as an excuse." Victoria's face changed, her smile dry, a trace of guilt flickering in her eyes. But when she looked up again, she had taken up that pitifully poor sick beauty demeanor once more. "George, what are you talking about? How could I possibly know things that even you guys don't know, really?" George sneered, abruptly dumping a stack of materials onto the coffee table. There were several color prints of CCTV footage, clearly recording her sitting by my grandma's bed, sobbing. They also recorded the moment my grandma was hurried out for emergency treatment, and her face was filled with cold laughter. Even more, they recorded her being confronted by my hysteria, her face full of mockery. Compared to her current frail and gentle sick beauty image, it showed a considerable difference. Both my parents were dumbfounded, especially my mom, who looked incredulously at Victoria. "Christina, do you know that old woman? What are you looking for her for?" Victoria stuttered, tears falling first. "Yes, I know. I know she was the one who raised Victoria." I went to her, just afraid that Victoria would stick to George and not leave, continuing to snatch my marriage. I was hoping she could persuade Victoria not to seduce her brother-in-law and be her sister's mistress. I didn't expect her to suddenly develop a disease, let alone that my grandma would be unable to be rescued and die on the operating table. I clenched my fists tightly, the hatred in my heart almost made me want to tear Victoria apart. Grandma really loved me. How could she stand such a blow? What she was least willing to do was to drag me down. I clearly remember that day. The weather was overcast, the hospital corridor was filled with the smell of disinfectant. Every breath I took, the moisture in my heart was being drained away, turning into a knife, cutting every capillary in my body. Doctors and nurses were implacably telling me that Grandma was gone, permanently. I was driven out of my mind and wanted to take Victoria's life. But my sister looked at me proudly and disdainfully, telling me, "Christina, what right do you have to make me repay my life? My life is still owed by you. As long as I have heart disease, Mom will always be heartbroken for me, and she will dislike you, so what if George is addicted to you? With me, you will always be the mistress." Actually, 10 years ago, I intentionally complained like that because I saw you and George playing in the garden. He gave you candy and smiled at you. He never smiled at me, he was always just saying, "You will be okay soon." Why? Why can you, Christina, be okay, and I can't? So, she took advantage of her situation, made light of few words, and our parents drove me off. Let me disappear from George's world. Christina, as long as I exist, no one in this world will truly love you. Grandma's gone, how can anyone still genuinely love me? Christina, you are really pitiful. An old woman who isn't blood related could be so significant that you would go out of your way for her. Instead of thinking about dying together with me, you might as well go die sooner to keep her from walking alone. In the surveillance video, Victoria's every word was played back clearly. My mom covered her mouth, her tears shedding uncontrollably, couldn't believe these words are coming from her dearest daughter. You drove Victoria to death? Christina, she's your sister, no matter how much you hate her. How could you? So my mom thinks as long as she spares my life, no matter how she treats me, she won't annihilate affection. She would still be a qualified and good mother? It was better to drive me to death like Victoria did. She would rather acknowledge that old woman as family than consider you as her mother. Mom, please wake up. When Victoria saw this, she didn't continue to pretend. Her eyes were filled with clear hatred towards me, staring at Mom. Her face twisted with anger and resentment, glaringly ugly. Mom, you and I are the same. We are both poor ghosts being burdened by Christina. How great it would be if she died. The world would be quieter. Christina even thanked me for waking her up to go die. What Victoria said was indeed correct. Her words did indeed wake up the desperate me at the time. I couldn't even be bothered to collect Grandma's body. The person was already dead. Where the body was, did it even matter? I just wanted to be with Grandma as soon as possible. She liked me the most. I couldn't let her walk alone. So, I ran out of the hospital and jumped off the river without a second thought. And Victoria just watched me sink down without moving a muscle. Her words left my mom speechless. A pallor spread over her face, seemingly realizing for the first time how terrible she had previously been to me. Victoria, you won. It seems like twins have always been like this. One is a debtor, the other a lender. Now it appears that from the moment you had heart disease, I was destined to be the debtee. I wonder, did I really win in our mother's womb? If I had known what kind of mother she would be, I would rather give you my life, so you can live two people's worth. I said all of this to Victoria, sighed lightly, and felt an overwhelming sense of tiredness. Not wanting to listen to this dramatic event any longer, I decided to go upstairs for some rest. No! Don't go, Christina! A heartbreaking scream sounded behind me. I jumped, turned my head, and saw my mom staring straight at me, her eyes red and filled with exhaustion. With a start, I wondered, couldn't she also be? While I was speculating, my mom rushed me, her tear floodgates opened. But years of indifference had left her unable to articulate words of apology. Is that really you, Christina? You, please don't go, okay? Your sister didn't mean to drive you to death. Please forgive her, and despite everything that had happened, she was still pleading for Victoria. I looked down at the shoes that Grandma had bought for me, and I couldn't help but smile at the situation. Actually, I had always been looking forward to the day where you would finally hug me. But see, our mother-daughter fate is indeed inexistent. Now, we can't even hug each other. Christina's mom isn't a good mom, so Christina doesn't want a mom anymore. Let's not meet in our next life, shall we? My mother trembled, reaching out to embrace me, but how could she? George abruptly stood up, grabbed my mother. Can you see her, too? My mother showed a shocked expression, nodded vigorously. Yes, I can see her. George, you have a way, right? Can Can you save her? Victoria was scared to death by the two of them. She looked in my direction with a ghostly white face, raising her voice incredulously. What on earth are you doing? Christina has been dead for long. She's dead. Haven't you all hated her? She's already dead. Who are you pretending to be compassionate for? George initially showed no reaction to her words, but at the end, he suddenly looked up, his eyes sharply focusing on her. This was the first time George was so harsh to my sister. My sister froze. If it wasn't for you constantly instilling in me that Victoria was getting close to me, just habitually competing with you. How could I have treated her that way? No matter how much she was bullied or wronged, she accepted all my demands, but I just thought she wanted to steal your things, wanted money. I was angry, always angry that she didn't think of me in her heart. George's voice was not loud, but every word, every sentence, carried an unspeakable despair and pain. I was taken aback. So was my sister, but soon after, she broke into hysterical laughter. George! Do you think you're some kind of romantic hero? Do you think that, as long as you shift the blame onto me, you're not wrong? At root, what's the difference between you, me, and our mom? All of us unwilling to accept our own misery, transferring our anger onto Christina, a despicable tactic. What has Christina been through? Why was she so in need of money? Why did she agree to be your scapegoat? Is this hard to investigate? But has any one of you looked into it? She has explained so many times, looked for so many opportunities to talk to you. Have you ever trusted her? None of you have. Because you are all the same, only willing to believe the Christina in your hearts, a nagging ghost from the womb, morally corrupt, beyond redemption. Victoria was always gentle and weak. I had never imagined that one day she would shriek with such fury. My mom shivered, raising her gaze towards her. Christina. How could you say that? Victoria is your sister. You didn't even treat her as your daughter, so why should I regard her as my sister? Victoria had given up any pretense, laughing coldly at my mother. Mom. Have you forgotten how you called her a nagging ghost, saying she was unworthy? Now what? The person has died and motherly love is awakened? My mom's chest was heaving, unable to utter a word. Because she was right. Every person in this room contributed to my suicide. But none of them were the actual culprits. They used their cold violence, taking advantage of my expectations, recklessly demeaning and hurting me. Victoria was right. At the root of it was them, who never respected me. They thought I was the sinner, owing Victoria, so they could justifiably mistreat me, justifiably digest those dark aspects they didn't want to face. Casting a side glance, Victoria noticed the spiritual items on the side table and suddenly understood something. Living in a hospital for years, Victoria read more than anyone else there. Of course, she guessed what the items there were for. She also understood why both my mother and George could see me. She lunged forward and held the spiritual items in her arms. She turned her head and laughed wildly at my father. Dad, neither of us can see Christina, huh? Seems like you and I are the same. We never took her to heart. My father showed an angry embarrassment from being caught in his thoughts. He shouted in a low voice, "What nonsense are you talking about?" Where am I talking nonsense? Don't you simply don't love us, right? Victoria sneered, her gaze falling on my mother's face. Mom, the root of why my grandparents despise you is that my dad never steps up. You don't want to admit that you married a useless man, so you blame Christina. How are you any better than me? My mother clapped her hand over her mouth, not even giving Victoria a small fragment of attention. She just cried and said to me, Victoria, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Can you please not leave? Your mom will treat you better in the future. Victoria! Put that down. George's usual calm demeanor was instantly shattered. He panicked like a poor boy who had just smashed a valuable antique, helpless but harrowed. Victoria looked at him, sneering without end. So, you really fell in love with her, huh? George, weren't you always the one who cherished me the most? We've been friends since we were kids, you've pampered and loved me for so many years, and yet you were snatched away by Christina, right? I will never let you have the chance to see her, never. Victoria picked up the nearby lighter, lit it, and approached the spiritual items. George panicked immediately. Don't. Christina, please don't. Victoria gave a twisted grin, even as her eyes reddened. She ignited the items with the lighter, and she laughed, then cried. We were so close, I could have married you and been happy. Why? George was already rushing over, pushing Victoria away, and grabbed the thing from her arms. Victoria fell down heavily, clutching her chest and curling up. It hurts so much. George, save me, please. Save me. She seemed to really have a heart attack, her lips turning blue and large sweat beads bursting out on her forehead. But George didn't even glance her way, frantically putting out the fire. Luckily, the object didn't burn easily, only slightly smoldered, and the fire was out. My father rushed over, picked up my sister again, and started for the door. George coldly watched his retreating figure, his voice chilling, "Don't let her die. Once she recovers, send her to the place where Christina used to live. Have her endure the suffering Christina went through, otherwise your family will go bankrupt. Uncle should know, I'm not joking." My dad's steps halted abruptly. After a few seconds of silence, he grudgingly agreed. Victoria in his arms was delirious with pain, laughing like a maniac. Madman! Everyone was mad, father and daughter left, and the only thing left in the spacious living room was my mother sobbing and apologizing. I couldn't even look at her anymore, just staring silently at the black object in George's hand. I really began to doubt. Do they really see me because of spirit communication? And just like confirming my guess, my mother suddenly screamed, "George! Look, sure enough, I was right." My soul started to fade away. The first to turn transparent were my feet. George turned around, saw this, and almost widened his eyes, incredulously stepping back. How can I disappear? I actually feel quite relaxed, it's not bad, right? No, it's not. George was shaking his head frantically, his face distorted with pain, crying silently, which shocked me greatly. He was crying? The man who was still so cold and calm when he saw my body was now crying? Christina, don't leave me, don't be so cruel, don't make me watch you disappear. I would go mad. I watched his madness get thicker, shook my head, and said no more. The dissipation of the soul was not quick. 2 days passed, and I had only disappeared up to my calves. When George opened his eyes and saw me without my calves, he revealed a desperate smile that wanted to cry but couldn't. He hurriedly picked up his phone, but he didn't get any reply that could keep me. After struggling to breathe for a few times, he suddenly looked up at me. Christina, what should I do? His voice was shaking badly. I watched him quietly. Watched him tumbling out of bed, rummaging through everything like mad, trying to find something related to me. But in the end, he only found a small corner of a photo. Very small, just half of my eye. But George held it like a treasure, in his hand, close to his heart. Tears fell like rain. Christina, I'm sorry, I was too angry before, I threw away everything you left behind, your photos, they were all burned. What should I do if you disappear? How should I see you again? I tilted my head. You should forget me. Just like you've always done. After all, you're going to forget me sooner or later. I heard George hold his head in his hands and let out a desperate whimper. My mother also started running here frequently. She brought bags and bags of women's clothes, and she cooked food every day like a madwoman, serving dish by dish to the dining table. With a careful look, she introduced me, Victoria, I don't know what you like to eat. You smell every dish. Which one do you like? After you come back to life, Mom will cook it for you, is that okay? And also, Mom has bought you many beautiful clothes. We can go shopping together. How about it? I don't want to. I want to be with my grandmother. Victoria was lucky she survived. My father, who really didn't care about family relationships, sent her to the place where I used to live in order to stabilize the company. He only gave her $60 a month to live on. But the person looking after her was not a good person like my grandmother. It was a lazy and good-for-nothing woman with a temper bigger than a spoiled princess. Whenever Victoria was unhappy, she would start swearing. The curses were very harsh, she specialized in cursing things that Victoria hated to hear. She cursed her as a bastard that was not wanted by her parents, a monster with a hole in her heart, and it was just right that she ended up in this state. Victoria, who used to be pampered by her parents and loved ones, now no one cared about her. How could she stand it? She took the opportunity to run to outside George's house, pleading with my mother to come out and look at her. "Mom, didn't you love me the most? My heart hurts so much, come look at me. Didn't you care about me the most? Look at me," but my mother turned a deaf ear, just looking at me with a flattering face, looking for nearby scenic parks. She asked carefully, "Victoria, are you bored at home? Do you want to go out with Mom?" I looked down at my disappearing arm, truly speechless. "Going to the park with a floating head, wasn't she scared?" "Victoria, Mom has already divorced your dad." My mother suddenly put down the magazine in her hand, looking at me with red eyes. "You're right, Christina. I married a man who only cares about benefits and has a lack of affection. It wasn't good of me, it was Mum's fault, but Victoria, I beg you, please pity Mum, can you let me make it up to you?" I was silent for a moment, thought about it, and finally spoke, the first sentence to her in many days. "It was good, just try to live a good life." My mother's body jerked violently, and then, she couldn't stop crying. "Victoria, how can Mum save you? How can she help you?" The upstairs door suddenly opened, and George, who had been up for days and hadn't shaved, rushed down. He picked up the fruit knife on the table and was about to slice his wrist. I was shocked. "What are you doing?" George's face had lost a lot of weight, looking like an addict, but his eyes were very bright. Someone just said, "Blood can nourish the soul, we can share life, I can save you." When my mother heard this, she also hurriedly stretched out her wrist. "I can, too. But I just refused lightly, but I don't want to. I just want to disappear as soon as possible. This world is not good for me, I don't want to live. Just give me peace and don't bother me anymore. I will be happy without you. I will go to heaven first, you live well, live a few more years, and bother me less." The look on George's face was full of panic, begging me desperately. His face was full of so many tears that I felt as though I had seen all the tears of his life. "Christina, don't disappear. I beg you, don't disappear. You have suffered so much, we haven't treated you well, please don't disappear. I beg you, tell me, how can I save you, how can I save you?" Extreme despair drove George into crazy grief. He seemed to be at a loss and grabbed a handful of sweets from the fruit plate on the table, holding them up to me. "Christina, I will buy you sweets. Can you please stay? I will make your future life very sweet, please, don't disappear." His hands were trembling terribly. A large portion of the colorful glass sweets were shaken away. My soul had disappeared to my nose. George was desperate. He slowly kneeled in front of me. To whom should I plead? "Who can give you back to me?" My mother was crying so loudly that she was speechless, clutching her heart and falling aside, mourning my name. "Victoria. My Victoria!" Even my ears were gone. Their cries of desperation gradually disappeared. My consciousness was completely obliterated. I thought before I disappeared, how nice. I didn't hear that disgusting sentence. I returned to heaven. The soul ferryman still sat in front of the stall, cooking soup. Seeing me coming back, she didn't speak, but served me a bowl of soup. "Try this, is it good?" I took it, took a deep breath, and took a sip. I was about to swallow with my eyes closed, a familiar taste spread on my tongue. I opened my eyes sharply. Grandma's soup. I laughed and cried, "Granny, you learned pretty quickly. Should I be reincarnated? My grandmother is probably far away, I will have to run." A gust of wind suddenly blew off the hat of the soul ferryman. A familiar and loving face was exposed. "Grandma?" Grandma lovingly touched my head, her voice echoed throughout heaven, "I will always make the soup that Victoria loves." After I left, my mother seemed to have developed a mental problem and did not successfully divorce my father. Instead, she was taken back by my father and lived with Victoria. At first, Victoria was quite happy. But my mother was so indifferent that she couldn't recognize people, and she held my only ugly doll left at home all day, calling for Christina. She cooked for it, bought clothes, bathed, and made up. She gave all her maternity to the doll. My sister by her side became the old me, suffering from my mother's coldness, my mother's insults and disgust. Sometimes even in the middle of the night. My mother would sneak into her room with a basin of cold water and wakened her by pouring it on her. Then she laughed and scolded, "You are this debt collector. You made Christina ignore me." Such actions are quite a lot. Under such torment, Victoria's heart disease showed signs of recurrence. Sick every day, no one sent her to the hospital. She was just hanging on, bearing my mother's cold violence and weeping regret every day. George drank for several days in a row and gave himself a stomach ulcer. If it wasn't for the timely discovery of his assistant, he almost died in the room I used to live in. In the ward, George looked deadpan, stared at his assistant, tightly holding my torn photo, with a voice full of pain. "I miss Christina, I want to die," but Christina said, "Let me live, I will live." Assistant sighed and took a photo from his pocket and handed it to George. "Boss, this is a photo of Miss Victoria that I accidentally took with my phone, although it's only half of her face, but..." George took the photo, tears gushed out. With misty eyes, he looked up at his assistant and said softly, "Thank you." After that day, George suddenly seemed alive, no longer drunk and decadent. Every day is a day of normal life and work. Just when he has free time, he will look at the half of the photo in a daze. Later, he finally agreed to cremation and buried me and my grandmother together. The location he chose was great, facing the sea, quiet and secluded. The surroundings are full of roses he planted by hand, blooming beautifully. On the tombstone, our names were engraved, the tomb of Christina and her granny. My grandmother and I will live well in the future.